Hello, and welcome to our special live event on demystifying research grants, deciding where your money goes, presented by the NBIA Disorders Association. We are so pleased you could join us and appreciate those of you who submitted questions in advance. I'm Patricia Wood, president of the organization. At NBIA Disorders Association, we know that easily accessible resources and accurate, reliable information are critical for you and your loved ones. That is why we thought you would find this webinar on our research grant award process helpful. I'm happy to see families from our 5 most common disorders here today and that we have 10 countries represented. We rely on our NBIA families fundraising to support our research program, and we hope you will come away from this webinar with an understanding of what happens when the funds we receive, with the refunds we receive for that purpose. If you can't stay for the entire event, we will have a recording available for later viewing, and we'll share highlights of the webinar online. We are also live streaming the webinar on Facebook, and it will be available there for viewing also. We have a very short survey, only 3 questions when you leave the webinar, and we would appreciate your feedback on this webinar and your help in planning future ones of interest to our families. If you would like to ask a question during the webinar that pertains to the grant award process, you may do so with the Q&A function, and we will try to answer if time permits. I'd like to thank 2 members of our Scientific and Medical Advisory Board, which plays a critical role in our grant program, for joining me today to discuss our research grant award process. They are Dr. Suzanne Jackowski of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis and Dr. Arnold Strauss of Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. Their bios are on their website under our link for our Scientific and Medical Advisory Board, but I'd like to ask Dr. Strauss and Jackowski to share a little bit about their background and their wide experience in reviewing grant proposals that makes them such an asset to our Scientific and Medical Advisory Board. Dr. Strauss, would you like to share?
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. My specialty is pediatric cardiology, and I've been working in rare disease genetic diagnosis for over 40 years, funded by the NIH here in the United States for that entire time. And in the process, have reviewed grants for many different organizations, including the NIH and other rare disease family organizations. So I'm delighted to be a member of the Scientific and Medical Advisory Board for NBIA and to participate in trying to help improve care and outcomes for families and patients. Susie?
You're muted, Susie.
Sorry. Thank you, Arnie, and thank you, Patty, for hosting this webinar. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I received my PhD in biomedical sciences from the graduate school at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and I'm a basic scientist. That's what I do, and I study the regulation of coenzyme A. After 2 fellowships, first in physiology and the second in microbiology, I started my lab at St. Jude in 1980. And I've been studying coenzyme A regulation for the last 40 years. During that time, I've also reviewed for several years for both the National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health for a variety of grants on related topics. And I've also been on several editorial boards for scientific journals, primarily in the area of biochemistry. And I was also an editor for a significant and long-established journal. It has a Latin name. It's called Biochimica Biophysica Acta. But nevertheless, it's largely a European journal. But I was the editor who made the final decisions whether to accept, revise, reject submitted manuscripts based on their science. So it really is an honor to be with you today and on the board, the Scientific and Medical Advisory Board of the NBIA Disorders Association, and I hope that we can provide you with information and process today.
Thank you both for sharing, Dr. Jackowski and Dr. Strauss. And it's helps them know why our organization is so lucky to have you both advising us on research matters. So, first I'd like to go over a little bit of background. I know some of you are newer to the NBIA community and might not know our background. We were founded in 1996, so we're going on our 25th year next year that we are a nonprofit supporting families affected by NBIA disorders. We've participated in and organized the very first scientific symposium was in 2000, and it was in conjunction with our very first family conference. And the second research symposium was in 2005, and both of those were in Bethesda, Maryland, tied to the NIH that funded those symposiums. Since then, we participated in other ones going forward. And we have a renowned scientific and medical advisory board, Drs. Hayflick and Hogarth, who are the leading experts on NBIA disorders that are part of that. And they're all advising us on research funding. And we're a member of the NBIA Alliance. We helped found it with the German NBIA organization. So we have 9 countries at this time working together to forward research for NBIA disorders. And I'll share a little later how we collaborate on research funding with other partners. So our priorities here are, of course, to find cures for NBIA disorders. And to do that, as Dr. Jackowski shared, we have to look at strategic work in basic and clinical research. And our job is to help accelerate that pace and generate resources for the scientific community that will help us advance NBIA disease knowledge. And our grants are primarily to produce preliminary data so that the researchers can then go to NIH or in the Europe to Eurordis and get further funding to continue on their work. So before they can even ask for big funding, they have to have preliminary data. And so this is essential for them to get higher funding. So at this time, we are going to talk about the request for proposals. And that's when we've received funding from the families. They've raised enough funding so that we have the funds. Right now, our minimum is $45,000 for a grant call. And when we have $45,000, we move to determining our research priorities. And I'm going to turn it over to Arnie and Dr. Strauss and Dr. Jackowski to talk about our research priorities and how we get our review committee members if we need more, and the responsibilities. So I'll turn it over to them.
So the key for funding is to have strong science. And if you show the next slide, Patty. The key to the evaluation process is how good the science is. So what new information will be obtained that will help move the field forward and help understand the disorders and ultimately develop potential therapies for the disorders. It's also very important to know that the proposed research fits into the current knowledge, that the person who proposes the grant has actually reviewed the field and knows what is already well known and proposes something that will extend that knowledge. It's critical to have a good system to study it, whether it's a cell-based system, an animal-based or organ model, or a human study. And we can learn from all 3 of those, but it has to be appropriate to the questions asked. Next slide, Patty. The key in the evaluation is the quality of the proposal. That is, will it utilize appropriate methods? Will it evaluate the results from the experiments proposed in an appropriate and statistically appropriate way? That is, are there appropriate numbers of controls and are enough experiments proposed to determine quality data that will be sustained and be able to be evaluated by other investigators to use for their own research. It's absolutely critical that the investigator, that is the applicant, have both experience and an environment which lets them do the proposed studies. That is, are the studies feasible to do in the environment and in the laboratory, and are there sufficient trained personnel to accomplish those goals? So the experience of the investigator, the track record of the investigator in publication and in the field of NBIA disorders are critically important. Next slide, and Susie.
Thanks, Arnie. When I was trying to think about how we can convey what we actually do on a grant review panel, and I just thought I would give you an example of what would be an unfundable grant. What are problems that we run across when we have to evaluate the application? Words are cheap. Okay, and you have to be able, the feasibility of what you want to do has to be evident in the application. So first, if you choose to these are several things here. I guess we're on slide 8 already.
We'll talk about research priorities after this, Susie, okay? So you can just share on this.
Sure, sorry. We're a little out of line here. That's okay. If the measurements that the investigator tells you they're going to make, you have to actually know a little bit about those measurements yourself, if they're technically doable, or if they just will give you very small differences that will be hard to distinguish the disease condition from the normal healthy condition of, let's say, your cells or your mice. Maybe they're proposing to do something extraordinary, but they want to start with a small amount of material. That's not going to work. A lot of proposals we see propose to, after they establish a biological system, let's say a cell system, they want to screen a chemical library, which involves doing thousands and thousands of assays. But you have to have that measurement that will give you enough difference so that you can tell what is normal and what is not normal over thousands of very small samples. That's a technical challenge. And then it does get to the chemistry in the case of screening a library, and you just want to reject those molecules that won't even come close to being effective down the road for human therapy. And as Arnie mentioned, there has to be some evidence of experience, either with publications or background training with known individuals who have expertise that will help the applicant convince you that they can do the work that they propose. Arnie already mentioned the choice of the biological system is very important. And just as an example, a lot of the works comes out of the fly models of disease, but sometimes that isn't a good pick. And for example, the way that myelin is made, that's the lipid that coats the nerves in the brain. The myelin is made in a different way in flies compared to mammals, which includes humans. So that's probably not a model to choose to begin to study the pathophysiology of a disease that would affect the nerve function and the coating around the nerves. If there's no experience in of the biological system, there's a lot of great work that's being done with pluripotent stem cells and differentiating them or transforming them into the disease type cell type. But that's a long process. It takes months to go through that culture. And if there's a person who doesn't really have a lot of culture experience in cell culture, they're going to get contamination, and it's not going to work. So you evaluate the investigator there. And then they just don't know what they really want to do, and they really find something, and they'll make every single measurement in the world, buying various kits from commercial sources. Now, these kits, some of them do not have the greatest quality control. So I think the applicant needs to know something about what they really want to study, and not just do a broad survey of everything that's possible. That would also take too much time. And then if they do get a result, how do they recognize the result? There's normal biological variation in science, in biological experiments. And we call that just, if you have a measurement or a level of something, biological variation, you can just bounce around the baseline. And how are you going to, a real result is actually like 10 times greater. And, or just as an example. And, it really hits you. But I know sometimes some people make a career out of bouncing around the baseline. And if you're really good at talking about it, you can really convince somebody about it. So anyway, these criteria have to be decided upon and explained, and understanding the techniques that are going to be used really is helpful in an application. So we can...
Okay, thank you. Thank you both for sharing on the evaluation process. And in part of that, I'd like you both to share on how we determine research priorities for each grant call. So Dr. Strauss, would you like to share on that, how we determine research priorities?
Well, part of the prioritization has to do with what the dollars are contributed for, what the families are interested in, which disease of the many NBIA disorders will be studied. But when we're reviewing the grants that are submitted, we're really interested in what's, as I said before, what's most likely to be able to be done, that is what's feasible. What's most likely to provide information that will help move understanding far enough along that we can then utilize that for the next step. And the next step may be understanding the mechanism, or it may be evaluating a potential therapy, or it may be developing the processes, for example, that are needed for that therapy. But it has to be exciting. It has to be something that will really change thinking and move the field forward. So the prioritization has to do with the subject matter, which disease, and the scientific merit of what's being proposed. And then it really helps if the application can generate some excitement and some enthusiasm in the person who's evaluating the application. Susie, your thoughts?
What, Dr. Strauss, before we move on for that, when we're simply determining a grant call, we're going to put out a request for proposals. How do we, like if we're going to do one for BPAN, how do we determine how broad to make that grant call, the research priorities? At that time, can you talk a little bit about the process we go through to write the grant call?
Yeah, I think we know enough about these disorders that Susie knows a lot more than I do. But to know where we stand with the state of knowledge. And so when we write the request for proposals, we want to make sure that we're requesting applications that will address the next step, something that will advance the field. And we also recognize that there are many other facts that have been determined about other rare diseases that will help us in thinking about how to address NBIA disorders. So potential, for example, for gene therapy, or the potential for modifying mitochondrial function, or the potential for altering iron metabolism in general. And so we set the priorities based upon where the field is and where we think it's going.
Yes, absolutely, Arnie. I can't agree with you more. And I just wanted to point out to the people in the webinar is that I'm a library rat, and I love to search the literature. And so I think one of the things that I contribute to the review process is to enhance our understanding of where the field is by really bringing out those literature points that will tell you that it's an important area to study, or these are the next challenges that we have to address in a particular disease. I rely heavily on Arnie, though, for his clinical experience. I am a laboratory rat as well, and I really admire the work that the clinicians do. Their encyclopedic understanding on a very, very broad level of the human condition is really necessary to evaluate, and I'm glad we have that expertise on the panel.
And that brings up a good comment that we always like to have at least 5 reviewers on a grant review committee, so that you can get a variety of backgrounds and all of them working together to give a full view and comprehensive ability to review a grant. And Susie, could you share a little bit about when you've been the leader on a grant review, what's involved in that process?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that, Patty. As a grant leader, after I receive all the grants from Patty as she collects the applicants at each grant deadline, I evaluate the distribution of the types of grants, and several of the members of the Scientific and Medical Advisory Board I invite them to join the panel to review the grant group and help us have a collective decision about the fundability or not funded, or the quality of the proposal. There are 3 assignments for each grant. Each grant is assigned with a primary reviewer on the panel. Then there's also a second reviewer on the panel, and both of them have to write their comments, their why, justifying the strengths and the weaknesses of the proposal. And then we also have a reader who actually reads it and actually helps to broaden the scope of knowledge in the review process. And then, of course, everyone else on the panel can listen. And as moderator, I moderate there's a discussion, there's a preliminary score for each grant, and then we score on a range of 1 to 5, with 1 being the highest, 5 being low. And we not enthusiastic about that, a 5. And so then we after all the grants are reviewed, we've been doing it by Zoom meetings and conference calls. Then we all look at the collective, arrive at a final prioritization and final scores. And then after that, I summarize the general discussion and the scores, and I send all that information to Patty. And that's what takes reviewing grants. It's actually a lot of work. We try to send the grants to the reviewers 3 to 4 weeks before we actually have our face-to-face meeting. So it's quite a process. Everybody works hard on their special expertise that is represented in each grant to understand what the applicant wants to do and to evaluate whether it's a good idea or not. So that's the process, Patty. And do you have any questions?
No, thanks for sharing that, Susie. And then once the leader of the review committee sends it to the Board of Trustees, what their recommendations are in the scoring of the grants. But it is ultimately our Board of Trustees that looks over the recommendations and makes the final decision on what will be funded. So, and then after that a grant has been awarded, the Board of Trustees has voted, then I will go back to the researchers and let them know, and then I will send them our grant agreement. So let me go here to, this is our, let's see. Okay, so this is our grant agreement, the information that we send to the researcher, and we tell them that in order to fund your grant, you must comply with these requirements. And so the first 3 are things that if they informed consent, if they're doing a trial or something of that, and then if what they're doing for gene therapy, and that clinical drug trials, of course, must meet the Food and Drug Administration requirements. And then we tell them that they must make the journal available for others to read once it's been published. So they have, within 6 months of publication, it has to be out there and available so that our families can find that paper and read it for themselves. And then we insist that research resources must be shared, and National Institute of Health has guidelines that they're familiar with, and it tells and details how those resources must be shared. And then we don't give the researchers all the money up front. We give them a starting amount that they can start doing the work in their laboratory, and then we give, at the middle of the project, they have to submit scientific and financial reports that our review board, Scientific and Medical Advisory Board, reviews and makes comments if needed. And then we, at the end, is when we will give them the final amount after everything's been reviewed. And if they don't spend all the money, we don't give it all to them, only what their budget has been spent. And then once the PI has finished the grant, he has 3 months to give us all the information. And if there are serious deviations, there haven't been very often, but once or twice, we might not fund the rest of the grant. We would say this just isn't meeting what was in the grant agreement, therefore you won't be getting your final payment or wherever it's at. And then we've made it so that if the researcher isn't giving us those reports for any reason, they can't apply for any other grants until they're current. So that they'll be penalized for not being on time with their reports. And we want to know if something changes at their institution, if the PI isn't able to do the work anymore, then they need to let us know that immediately so we can judge how that's going to might interfere. And then we ask them to attend our family conferences and share with our families their work, and also to give us a lay report so that we can report in our newsletter. You might have seen in our last newsletter, there was 2 reports on research grants, and we have another newsletter coming up soon that'll have a couple more research reports. So we take that very seriously, letting our community know what has gone on with the funding that they have provided for us. And we have some collaborations I mentioned earlier. The BPAM families know the University of Pennsylvania, the $1 Million Bike Ride has been so great because the Orphan Disease Center offers $30,000 that you can match, that they will match for the first $30,000 that you fundraise. And so for the last 3 years, our BPAM families have participated in the $1 Million Bike Ride. The first 2 years, it was $50,000 that they matched, but now they're down to only $30,000. But we got the $50,000 match, and now this last year, even with the pandemic and doing a virtual ride, our families raised $35,000, and it was matched with $30,000. So we're going to have a grant call in the fall for $65,000 for BPAN research. And then when our organization, our families raise money and we put it in a fund for, most of the time it's disease specific. So if we don't have enough in the fund to get to the minimum of $45,000, we might collaborate with somebody else so that we can get a grant call going. And we've done that the past couple of years with the Italy NBIA organization, ISNAF, and the German one, Hoffensbaum e.V. We have a grant agreement in place, and we have pooled our money and offered grants for PCAN and for BPAM. We had 2 grant calls for MPAM, but unfortunately, neither time a grant was awarded. There was various reasons why they weren't fundable, and so we are still looking to expand and do another MPAN grant call. And the same, we had a PLAN grant call within our organization this year and did not get any we did not get any fundable grants out of that. So we're going to be working on that again. The NBIA Alliance has worked together. We have funded the International NBIA Patient Registry. So we are still funding that. I just sent a payment. Our organization is the fiscal sponsor for the NBIA Alliance. So I handle the payments for that. And I just sent another $40,000 to the International Patient Registry, which will help keep it running for another 9 months. And we're always open to working with other nonprofits that are looking at NBIA disorders and wanting to collaborate on research projects. Our main goal is to promote the research and move it forward by whatever means we can. So some of the results that we've had is that we've raised $2.2 million since 2002 in research funding. We've funded 41 grants and 6 contracts, and you can find a list of those on our website. We currently have 3 grants and 2 contracts that are still underway, so we haven't received final reports on those yet. And as I said, we have funds available now for MPAM, PLAN, and BPAM. So we are working on looking into how we can spend those best. And just to give you an idea of our results in contracts by year, you can see on the screen down here, the NBIA one is one that is spent on all NBIA disorders. And in the beginning, in 2002, when we first started, we didn't even have all these genes. It was just Hallervorden Spatz is what it was called, actually. So we had 3 grants there. And then we moved on and had some of these, this one here in 2003, that was the gene discovery for PLAN. And PCAN had been discovered in 2001, so that was our first grant specifically for PCAN. And you can see how it goes on here with the different diseases underneath. And 2012 is when the BPAN gene was discovered. And then you see here how this one, in 2018, the BPAM families raised all this money that we had for research. And that really set the pace for us, and they still continued here. And this shows in this chart how much has been raised for each of the disorders over the years since 2002. And like we said, how we decide what to spend is how it's raised. And in the beginning, it all went into a general fund. So that's how we funded the research for the PCAN gene and the BPAN gene. It was from money that PCAN or other families had raised. But starting in 2015, the families wanted to raise for specific disorders. And so we responded to that need and switched and let families designate the disorder that they were fundraising for. And that's what my main point is, that you have a voice. You can direct donations to research on a specific disease. Back in 2009, when there was economic problems, the Hayflick Lab lost their funding from NIH, and the families at the time, they were one of the only research labs in the country, in the world. And so we raised $250,000 to keep that lab open and to keep them working on NBIA. And if we hadn't, things would have been a lot different. A lot of genes might not have even been discovered. So that was a great accomplishment of our NBIA families, determined to keep NBIA research going. And then BPAN, like I said, is a great example of the family's fundraising. And you can see the difference since 2014. They've raised $632,000 for BPAN research. And PCAN, the families have also been fundraising, but some of it went to the CoAZ trial, which is different from our organization, and that's not reflected here. But all of our NBI families, the most common disorders, have worked hard over the years, and we've tried to be good stewards of their genes, of their money. So let me see here if we have any questions from the audience. Let's see. I don't see any that are applicable about the grant research process, but let me see here that some of the questions, if we answered all the questions that were submitted beforehand. And one that was, how was the money distributed? We discussed that. Is any shift in funding trends expected post? Okay, let's see here. So Susie or Dr. Strauss, if you would like to address, if you see due to the pandemic, if there's any shift in funding trends expected in the future, like funding from greater institutions or a community, if you would like to address that. Susie, would you like to start?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Yes, COVID-19 is definitely going to have a big impact on grant funding, I'm sure. What happened when the HIV pandemic happened in the early 80s was most of the grant funding at the National Institutes of Health was prioritized to understanding HIV and developing a treatment for it, and that lasted for several years. And the funding for other projects was much more challenging in competition with that. And that was, but that has since, so that it was a good move. They have made great progress in that area, and the funding better now. But now with this COVID-19 pandemic, I see the same type of situation evolving here. And this affects even more individuals, I think. I'm not sure. So that's what I see coming. Some journals are actually just giving priority to manuscript submissions concerning the coronavirus science and trials. Without, the journals are taking this up as well. So the granting agents are going to do it as well.
Thank you, Susie. And we have another question. Will there be a global initiative to develop CRISPR? Dr. Strauss, would you like to address that?
Sure, I think it's a very important question, and it's one of the indications of, I think, a general principle that's really important. That is, research that's done for other rare diseases or for other purposes. For example, the discovery of CRISPR had nothing to do with NBIA disorders, of course, but that discovery several years ago now has been directly relevant to the potential future research for gene therapy and is being used in several of the grants that have been funded for NBIA disorders already to create the mutations or to reverse the mutations for cell studies and animal studies. So there's a huge amount of research that's now being done using CRISPR technologies of various varieties to both create disease models and to use those disease models created by CRISPR to study the diseases and then potential therapeutics. So yes, that's a high priority because it's such a outstanding technology and can be used very specifically for rare disorders. But it's a very general technology as well that's used for many diseases. So we learn a lot by being aware, as Dr. Jackowski said, about the other accomplishments for other disorders. And we expect investigators for NBIA disorders to be able to be aware of that other literature and to use those techniques as they develop. And they are rapidly developing and changing to apply to NBIA disorder research. So there is a worldwide utilization of these techniques. Virtually half the labs in our institution that are studying everything else use those techniques and are developing them daily so that they're more effective, more specific, and potentially can be used in living organisms, not just in cells.
And so, Dr. Jackowski, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I emphasize potentially as well. It's not ready for humans yet. It's going to be a while. So it's not in the near future using CRISPR for human therapy.
Thank you. We did have a couple questions about the CoAZ trial that's being done at OHSU, and we advise you to just contact nbiacure.org for the status on that. They have the latest update. We're talking more about the process rather than specific trials. And another question was, how close are we to treatment or cure for BPAN? And either of you want to take a stab at that?
Well, Susie suggested that I might address that because I am a clinical physician, and I also, as in my role here in Cincinnati, have very strongly supported gene therapy research for other disorders, including sickle cell disease and rare neurologic disorders. We're not close to a cure or a definitive treatment yet. But I think it's very important to emphasize that the science is moving extremely rapidly, and the potential for gene therapy, again, that word, for gene therapy is still very high. There have been successful gene therapies for other rare disorders that are being tested in small numbers of patients with, I would say, some very encouraging results. But there are a huge number of issues that have to be addressed. And that's why animal models and cell models for NBIA disorders are so important. You can't just jump to humans. You have to understand the mechanisms, and then you have to test the therapies, and whether it's a drug therapy or a gene therapy in animal models, to make sure that they're potentially safe and effective. And so that's why one of the reasons it takes a fairly long period of time. But I would say, and again, in my opinion, we're much closer than we were 3 years ago, and huge degree closer than we were 10 years ago. So I don't know when it's going to happen, and I think it will be years yet, but I have some optimism for the future. because of the success that and the number of people that are working on other diseases that have had success to move towards an efficacious therapy.
Okay, thank you for that. Is there anything we could say on the most critical research for BPAN at this time? Would you venture anything on that? Either of you? Or
Susie, you want to take that?
Yeah. I think there needs to be real push on understanding the basic pathophysiology of the disease in an appropriate model. It relies on we predict that it's involved in a process that we still don't understand completely in the normal case. And so actually the BPAN research could actually contribute to just increasing that whole body of knowledge, in addition to actually addressing the specific problem that is involved in the disease. So I think it would be really beneficial as well as very important to get that additional information with BPAN, more basic preclinical research.
thank you, Susie. We just got a question from the audience asking, how do prospective research applicants learn about NBIA in order to answer research grant calls? And I have a database of researchers that I've grown over my 25 years. Every time I meet a researcher, I put them in our database. Every symposium, I get all the researchers there. Anyone on our SMAB sends me their names and say these researchers might be interested, we add them. And then also, our Scientific and Medical Advisory Board might post on their listservs that they have for different diseases. And I send it out to all our NBI Alliance members so that they can send it out to everyone in Europe and around all the countries that they're in, to any researchers. So we try, and we post it on our website and on our Facebook and social media. So we try to get as wide a net as possible. And if any families have researchers that they think might be interested, they are welcome to forward our grant call to them and ask them to participate. So all researchers are welcome, and we try and widen our community whenever we can. And that's how we try and get as wide a net as possible for our grant calls. So I don't see any other questions from the audience. I think we've covered everything, so that we're going to stop here. I thank everyone for being here, and I ask as you exit that you answer our short survey. And so that's the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for participating.